The smell of burning paper should never be sweet, but somehow the acrid smoke rising from our kitchen fireplace carried the faint essence of vanilla, the same scent that had clung to my dorm room walls for 4 years, absorbed from countless late-night study sessions fueled by vanilla lattes and desperate determination. I stood frozen in the doorway, still clutching my purse and the small potted orchid I'd bought to celebrate, watching my mother feed my college diploma to the flames with the methodical precision of someone destroying evidence of a crime. "Mom?" The word escaped as barely a whisper, caught somewhere between disbelief and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from driving 6 hours straight from graduation to share what should have been the proudest moment of my life. The diploma, my diploma, with its embossed seal and flowing script that read summa cum laude, curled at the edges, the gold lettering catching the firelight one last time before dissolving into ash. She didn't turn around. Her shoulders remained rigid. The kitchen smelled like jasmine tea and disappointment, a combination I'd grown intimately familiar with over the years. 4 years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated resentment. 4 years of pouring money into that school, money we didn't have, money I scrubbed floors for, cleaned toilets for, worked double shifts at the hospital for. She poked at the burning remnants with a fire iron, ensuring complete destruction. And for what? So you could come home and tell me you're throwing it all away for some ridiculous dream? The orchid trembled in my hands. I'd chosen it specifically. White petals with purple centers, resilient and beautiful, the kind of flower that bloomed against all odds. If you're enjoying the story of family conflict and difficult choices, take a second to hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think Sarah should do. Like me, I'd thought, in a moment of probably naive symbolism. Like the girl who'd worked 3 jobs while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, who'd tutored struggling freshmen for grocery money, who'd worn the same interview suit to 4 different job fairs because it was the only one she owned. I'm not throwing anything away. My voice found strength somewhere in the vicinity of my ribcage, though it still shook with the effort of remaining steady. The graduate program at MIT is an opportunity. An opportunity to stay poor forever? Margaret finally turned, and I saw the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She'd aged in the 4 years I'd been away, though she'd never admit it. Her voice carried years of accumulated exhaustion. Do you think I sacrificed everything so you could play scientist in some laboratory? So you could chase fantasies while I rot away in this house waiting for grandchildren I'll never have? The accusation hung between us like smoke, and I felt something crack inside my chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I'd practiced this conversation during the entire drive home, had imagined her face lighting up when I told her about Dr. Peterson's recommendation, about the research opportunity that could change everything. I'd pictured us crying together, maybe, the way mothers and daughters did in movies when dreams finally came true. Instead, I watched the last corner of my diploma blacken and crumble, taking with it the naive belief that success would somehow bridge the gap that had been widening between us since I first dared to want more than the life she had planned for me. I got into Northwestern's MBA program too, I offered, though the words tasted like ash. Full ride. I could start in the fall, be done in 2 years, make 6 figures right out of school. It was a lie wrapped in possibility. I'd been accepted, yes, but the idea of spending 2 years learning to maximize profit margins instead of solving the energy crisis felt like a betrayal of everything I'd worked toward. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or relief. Business school? Yeah, business school. I set the orchid on the kitchen counter, its delicate beauty seeming absurd in this moment of scorched dreams. That's what you want, right? Something practical? Something that guarantees a return on your investment? She studied my face with the intensity of someone reading fine print, searching for the catch she knew had to be there. You'd really do that? Give up your research thing? The way she said research thing made it clear she'd never understood what molecular biology meant to me, had never seen the wonder in unlocking the secrets of cellular energy production, had never felt the rush of discovery that came with understanding how life actually worked at its most fundamental level. To her, it was just another expensive hobby, another way for me to avoid the real world, where bills needed to be paid and futures needed to be secured. If that's what it takes, I said, though each word felt like a small death. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. I'd been lying to myself for months, maybe years, pretending that I could find fulfillment in conference rooms and quarterly reports, that the fire that had driven me through organic chemistry and molecular genetics and senior thesis research could be satisfied by PowerPoint presentations and market analysis. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. I'd rather fail pursuing what I loved than succeed at something that felt like prison. The kitchen clock ticked in the silence, each second marking the growing distance between what I wanted and what was expected of me. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its evening rhythm. Dinner preparations, television programs, the comfortable routines of people whose dreams had been safely contained within reasonable boundaries. The familiar weight of expectations settled over me. "I need to think about it," I said finally, because the alternative was admitting that I'd already made my choice the moment Dr. Peterson had pulled me aside after my thesis defense, his eyes bright with excitement as he described the groundbreaking research happening at MIT, the chance to work with the best minds in the field, the possibility of discoveries that could reshape how we understand energy and life itself. Margaret nodded, but I could see the suspicion lingering in her expression. She knew me too well to believe I'd surrender that easily. "Thinking is what got us into this mess," she said, turning back to the fireplace where my diploma had been reduced to glowing embers. "Sometimes you have to stop thinking and start living in the real world." But as I climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom, I wondered which world was more real. The one where dreams were practical and success was measured in salary figures, or the one where a girl from nowhere could discover something that mattered, something that lasted longer than quarterly earnings reports. The orchid remained on the kitchen counter, a small symbol of persistence in a house that had temporarily forgotten how to hope for impossible things. My phone sat silent on my nightstand, Dr. Peterson's number saved in my contacts, alongside the decision that would define the rest of my life. Tomorrow, I would have to choose between the daughter my mother needed me to be and the scientist I'd always known I was meant to become. This story gets even more intense. If you're invested in Sarah's journey, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Tonight, I fell asleep to the lingering smell of smoke and vanilla, dreaming of laboratories and possibilities that felt both impossibly distant and heartbreakingly close. The morning after the diploma burning, I awoke to the sound of my mother's voice drifting up through the floorboards, sharp, urgent, defensive. She was on the phone with someone, probably my Aunt Linda, dissecting the previous night's events with the clinical precision she reserved for family crises and medical emergencies. I lay still in my childhood bed, surrounded by the ghosts of who I used to be. Debate team trophies, science fair ribbons, a periodic table poster I'd insisted on hanging next to my mirror in 8th grade because I thought memorizing atomic weights would somehow make me special. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, 22 years old, with a molecular biology degree and research opportunities that would make most graduates weep with envy, hiding in a room decorated with the dreams of a girl who'd believed knowledge was the ultimate currency. That girl had been wrong about a lot of things, but she'd been right about one. Knowledge without the freedom to use it was just expensive decoration. "She thinks she's better than us now," my mother was saying, her voice carrying the particular brand of hurt that came wrapped in anger. 4 years at that fancy school, and she comes home talking about laboratories and research like we're supposed to be impressed. as if struggling to put food on the table for 24 years wasn't enough sacrifice. I closed my eyes and let the familiar weight of guilt settle over me like a blanket I'd never quite learned to throw off. The guilt was older than my college education, older than my first science textbook, older than the moment I'd realized that my hunger for knowledge was somehow seen as a rejection of the life my mother had built for us. It lived in the space between gratitude and ambition, feeding on every achievement that took me further from the daughter she needed me to be. My phone buzzed against the nightstand. A text from my college roommate, Jessica. "How'd it go with your mom? Did you cry happy tears? Did you guys celebrate?" 3 question marks followed by a champagne emoji, because Jessica lived in a world where mothers threw parties when their daughters got accepted to prestigious graduate programs. Jessica's mother had probably already started planning the My Daughter the Scientist photo album. I stared at the ceiling and tried to formulate a response that wouldn't require explaining the particular brand of love that came with conditions, that measured success in stability rather than passion, that saw dreams as luxuries we couldn't afford. How could I tell Jessica that my mother's love was fierce and protective and suffocating all at once? That she'd sacrificed everything to give me opportunities she'd never had, only to watch me choose paths she couldn't understand? Another buzz. This time it was Dr. Peterson, and my heart did something complicated when I saw his name. "Hope you had a good trip home. Just wanted to remind you that we need your decision by Friday. The MIT team is excited about the possibility of working with you. This research could be groundbreaking, Sarah. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. As if it were that simple. As if the voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my mother wasn't already cataloging all the reasons this was a mistake. The years of poverty ahead, the uncertainty, the selfishness of pursuing something that might never pay the bills or justify the investment my mother had made in my education. The voice that whispered that maybe she was right. Maybe I was just a spoiled girl who'd lost sight of what really mattered. I dragged myself out of bed and stood in front of the mirror, studying the reflection of someone caught between worlds. The girl looking back at me had her mother's stubborn chin and her father's restless eyes, though I'd only seen those in photographs since David Chen decided that responsibility was optional when I was 3 years old. I had calloused hands from years of part-time jobs, and a posture that spoke of long nights spent hunched over textbooks, of determination that had been forged in welfare offices and food banks, and the kind of desperation that comes with wanting more than your circumstances suggest you deserve. The house had gone quiet, which meant my mother had finished her morning ritual of dissecting my life choices with her sister. I found her in the kitchen, methodically cleaning the already spotless counters with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, as if the right amount of elbow grease could scrub away disappointment along with the stains. "Coffee's fresh," she said without looking up, and I recognized the peace offering for what it was. Margaret Chen might burn diplomas in fits of rage, but she still made coffee for her ungrateful daughter the morning after, still left my favorite mug next to the pot like a small flag of truce. I poured myself a cup and settled at the kitchen table, the same Formica surface where I'd done homework for 18 years, where we'd sat across from each other through countless conversations about grades and colleges and futures that seemed both inevitable and impossibly distant. The orchid I'd brought home sat in the center of the table now, looking somewhat ridiculous in its small pot, a tropical plant trying to thrive in suburban Illinois. "I've been thinking," my mother said, still not meeting my eyes, "about what you said last night, about business school." The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. "Yeah? Northwestern is a good school, prestigious, the kind of place that impresses people." She folded the dish rag with military precision, creased it exactly in half, then half again. "I called your cousin Michael this morning. You remember Michael? He got his MBA from Kellogg 5 years ago. Works for some consulting firm in Chicago now. Makes more money than his father ever dreamed of."
I knew where this was going. Michael, the golden child who'd turned a decent undergraduate degree into a six-figure salary and a house in the suburbs, who'd married his college girlfriend and produced two photogenic children who appeared regularly on his mother's Facebook feed. Michael, who'd never once questioned whether maximizing shareholder value was the highest possible use of his intelligence. He said he could put in a good word for you at his firm. After you graduate, I mean. Says they're always looking for smart girls with good work ethics. The phrase smart girls landed with particular emphasis, as if intelligence were something to be packaged and marketed rather than cultivated and followed wherever it might lead. That's really nice of him, I managed, though the words felt like concrete in my throat. My mother finally looked at me, and I saw something desperate in her eyes that made my chest tight. Sarah, I need you to understand something. When your father left, I had nothing. Nothing but you and a high school diploma and the absolute certainty that I would do whatever it took to make sure you had a better life than I did. I worked jobs that broke my back and my spirit because I believed that education was the way out. But education for what? So you could spend the rest of your life in some laboratory, making discoveries that might not matter to anyone but you? The question hung in the air like smoke from last night's fire, and I realized that we'd been having different conversations for years. She'd been talking about security, stability, the kind of success that could be measured in salary figures and benefit packages. I'd been talking about purpose, discovery, the chance to contribute something meaningful to the world's understanding of itself. We'd been speaking different languages while using the same words. The research could change how we power the world, Mom. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw her trying to process this information, trying to fit it into her framework of practical concerns and immediate needs. And how long would that take, this changing the world? I don't know, maybe 10 years, maybe 20, maybe never if we can't figure out the problems. The honesty felt like a confession. That's how research works. You don't know if you'll succeed until you try. 10 years. She said it like a death sentence. 10 years of poverty while you chase something that might not work? 10 years of me watching you struggle the way I struggled, except by choice instead of necessity? Her voice cracked slightly. I can't do it again, Sarah. I can't watch someone I love destroy themselves for a dream. The words hit me like a physical blow, because I understood what she wasn't saying. My father had been a dreamer too in his way. He'd talked about starting his own business, about getting rich quick, about all the schemes that would finally lift our family out of the paycheck-to-paycheck existence that had defined my early childhood. But dreams without discipline were just elaborate forms of selfishness. And when the dreams inevitably collapsed, he collapsed with them, leaving my mother to pick up the pieces alone. I'm not him, I said quietly. Aren't you? The question was barely a whisper, but it echoed in the sudden silence between us. Aren't you asking me to support you while you chase something uncertain? Aren't you asking me to believe that this time will be different? I wanted to argue, to point out all the ways that serious scientific research was different from get-rich-quick schemes, but the doubt had already taken root. What if she was right? What if I was just a more educated version of my father, dressed up in noble intentions but ultimately selfish, ultimately willing to sacrifice practical concerns for the sake of personal fulfillment?
My phone rang, cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a fire alarm. The number was local but unfamiliar, and I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer instead. Maybe the desperate need for any voice that wasn't either my mother's or the critic in my own head. Is this Sarah Chen? The voice was formal, professional, tinged with an authority that made me sit up straighter. Yes, this is Sarah. This is Dean Morrison from Northwestern University's Graduate School of Management. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I looked across the table at my mother, who was watching me with sharp attention, her instincts alert to the possibility of news that might shift the balance of our argument. No, not at all. How can I help you? Actually, I was hoping I could help you. I've been reviewing applications for our executive MBA program, and your file caught my attention. Your undergraduate record is exceptional, and I understand you've been accepted to our standard MBA program for the fall. Yes, that's correct. I tried to keep my voice steady, though I could feel my mother leaning forward, trying to catch every word. I wanted to discuss a special opportunity with you. We've received a significant endowment to fund a new initiative, a scholarship program specifically designed for students with exceptional academic records who are interested in the intersection of business and environmental science. Given your background in molecular biology, you would be an ideal candidate. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? The scholarship would cover full tuition, provide a living stipend, and include a guaranteed internship with one of our partner companies in the renewable energy sector. It's quite competitive. We're only selecting 5 students for the inaugural program, but based on your qualifications, I'd like to invite you to interview for the position. My mother was staring at me now, her expression shifting from suspicion to hope to something that might have been pride. I tried to process what the dean was saying, tried to understand how this changed everything or nothing at all. That's an incredible opportunity, I managed. When would you need an answer? Well, that's the thing. The funding just came through yesterday, and we need to move quickly to get the program started. I know this is short notice, but could you come in for an interview tomorrow, say 10 a.m.? Tomorrow, less than 24 hours to decide whether to pursue an opportunity I hadn't even known existed an hour ago. I looked at the orchid sitting between my mother and me, its delicate blooms somehow managing to look both fragile and determined in the morning light. Yes, I heard myself say. Yes, I'll be there. After I hung up, my mother and I sat in silence for a long moment, both of us trying to process this unexpected development. The scholarship sounded perfect, almost too perfect, a way to pursue business school while still maintaining some connection to environmental science, a compromise that might satisfy both our needs. But as I replayed the conversation in my mind, I realized that compromise wasn't what I wanted anymore. The dean's call had crystallized something I'd been avoiding, the recognition that I'd been looking for ways to make other people happy instead of ways to become who I was meant to be. The scholarship was generous, the opportunity was real, but it wasn't the choice my heart had already made in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking when I'd imagined myself in Dr. Peterson's lab, working alongside brilliant minds to unlock secrets that might change everything. This could be it, my mother said, her voice bright with possibility. This could be the answer we've been looking for. I nodded and smiled, but inside I felt the familiar weight of expectations settling over me once again. Tomorrow I would put on my interview suit and convince a dean that I belonged in his program. I would be articulate and impressive and grateful for this unexpected opportunity. And then I would have to decide whether getting what everyone else wanted for me was worth giving up what I wanted for myself. The coffee had gone cold in my cup, but I drank it anyway, tasting the bitter grounds that had settled at the bottom. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up to another ordinary day, but inside our kitchen, the future hung suspended between what was practical and what was possible, waiting for me to finally choose which version of myself I was brave enough to become. The Northwestern campus gleamed in the morning sunlight like a promise of everything my mother had ever wanted for me. Limestone buildings rose from manicured lawns with the confidence of an institution that had been shaping leaders for over a century. And as I walked toward the business school, I felt the weight of expectation pressing down on my shoulders like a perfectly tailored blazer that didn't quite fit. I had chosen my outfit carefully, the same navy suit I'd worn to job fairs, paired with the pearl earrings my mother had given me for graduation. The earrings had belonged to her mother, one of the few things that had survived the journey from Taiwan to America, and wearing them felt like carrying forward a legacy of sacrifice and pragmatism that stretched back through generations of women who had chosen security over dreams, because dreams were luxuries they couldn't afford. Dean Morrison's office overlooked the courtyard where future MBA students would network and strategize and learn to speak the language of profit margins and market penetration. The dean himself was exactly what I had expected: silver-haired, impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that came from decades of making decisions that mattered. He greeted me with a firm handshake and the sort of smile that suggested he was already mentally writing my acceptance letter. "Sarah, thank you for coming in on such short notice. Please, have a seat." He gestured to a leather chair positioned across from his mahogany desk, which was decorated with the usual academic accessories: books on leadership theory, a crystal paperweight, photographs of him with various dignitaries and business leaders. "I have to say, your academic record is truly impressive. Summa cum laude in molecular biology, research experience, excellent GRE scores. You're exactly the kind of candidate we're looking for." We talked for another 30 minutes about curriculum design and internship opportunities, about the renewable energy companies that had partnered with the program, about networking events and career placement statistics. Dean Morrison painted a picture of a future where I would graduate with connections to industry leaders, where my scientific background would give me a competitive edge in environmental consulting, where I would make the kind of salary that would finally justify my mother's faith in education as a path to prosperity. It should have been everything I wanted to hear. Instead, I felt like I was listening to someone else's life being planned out in careful detail. A life that looked perfect on paper but felt hollow at its core. "There is one thing I should mention," Dean Morrison said, as our conversation began to wind down. "The scholarship I described yesterday. It's quite generous, but it does come with certain commitments. Recipients agree to work for one of our partner companies for at least 3 years after graduation. It's a way of ensuring that the investment in your education pays dividends for the business community." 3 years. The number hit me like cold water. 3 years of working for companies whose primary goal was profit, whose environmental initiatives were often more about public relations than genuine commitment to change. 3 years of using my scientific training to help corporations appear more sustainable while fundamental problems remained unsolved? "That sounds reasonable," I said, because it did sound reasonable to everyone except the part of me that had spent 4 years falling in love with pure research, with the joy of discovery, unconstrained by market considerations. "Wonderful. I'll have my assistant prepare the paperwork. Assuming the interview goes well, and I can't imagine it won't, you should have an answer by tomorrow afternoon." I thanked him and shook his hand again, and then I was walking back across the courtyard, past students who looked confident and purposeful, past buildings that housed the machinery of American business education. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "How did it go? Call me as soon as you're done." Instead of calling, I found myself sitting in my car in the parking garage, staring at the concrete walls and trying to understand why I felt like crying when everything was going exactly according to plan. The scholarship was real, the opportunity was genuine, and I was about to secure the kind of future that would make my mother proud and ensure that I never had to worry about money the way she had. So why did it feel like surrender? My phone rang. Dr. Peterson's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Maybe the desperate need to hear a voice that understood the language of curiosity and wonder that had shaped my undergraduate years. "Sarah, I was hoping to catch you. How are things going?" "They're going," I said, which wasn't really an answer, but was all I could manage in that moment. "Listen, I just got off the phone with Dr. Martinez at MIT. She wanted me to tell you that they've had a breakthrough in the photosynthetic efficiency research. The work you did on chloroplast optimization as part of your senior thesis, it's directly applicable to what they're doing. She's convinced that with your background, you could contribute to something really significant." I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the headrest. "Dr. Peterson,
I I know you're under pressure to make a practical choice. I understand that. But Sarah, I've been in this field for 30 years, and I can count on one hand the number of students who had your instincts for research. You see patterns that other people miss, ask questions that other people don't think to ask. That's not something you can learn in a classroom. It's a gift. The word gift hung in the air between us, and I felt something crack inside my chest. A gift, not a burden, not a impractical luxury, but a gift. When was the last time anyone had described my scientific curiosity as something valuable rather than something selfish?
The deadline for MIT is Friday, he continued gently. I know that's not much time, but sometimes the most important decisions can't wait for convenient timing. After we hung up, I sat in the parking garage for another 20 minutes, watching people come and go, watching the ordinary machinery of academic life continue around me. Students hurried past with backpacks and coffee cups. Professors strode purposefully toward buildings where they taught the next generation how to navigate an increasingly complex world. Everyone seemed to know where they were going, except me. Finally, I drove home, dreading the conversation I knew was waiting for me. My mother was in the kitchen. Of course she was in the kitchen. And her face lit up with anticipation when I walked through the door. Well, how did it go? Did you get it? It went well, really well. Dean Morrison seemed impressed. I set my purse on the counter and tried to organize my thoughts into something resembling a coherent explanation. The scholarship is even more generous than he described yesterday. Full tuition, living stipend, guaranteed job placement after graduation. Sarah, that's wonderful! My mother's smile was radiant, the kind of expression I'd seen so rarely over the years that it made my throat tight. I'm so proud of you. This is exactly what you needed, exactly what we've been working toward. There are some conditions, I said carefully. I'd have to commit to working for one of their partner companies for 3 years after graduation. Environmental consulting, mostly corporate work. 3 years of guaranteed employment? That's not a condition. That's a blessing. She was already making plans. I could see it in her eyes. You'll be able to pay off any remaining student loans, maybe even help me with the mortgage. We could actually get ahead for once instead of just surviving. The weight of her dreams pressed down on me like gravity. For 24 years, my mother had been holding her breath, waiting for the moment when her sacrifices would finally pay off, when her daughter's success would justify all the pain and struggle and lonely nights spent wondering if she was strong enough to keep going. This scholarship represented everything she'd worked for, everything she believed education could provide. Mom, I need to tell you something. Something in my tone made her smile falter. What is it? Dr. Peterson called while I was driving home. The research program at MIT, there's been a breakthrough. They think the work I did as an undergraduate could contribute to something really important, something that could change how we think about renewable energy. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I watched my mother's face shift from joy to confusion to the kind of weary disappointment that comes with having the same argument too many times. Sarah, no! Mom, just listen. No, I won't listen to this again. You just came back from an interview where they offered you a full scholarship to a prestigious business school. They're practically handing you a successful career, and you want to throw it away for more school, more uncertainty? It's not throwing anything away, it's choosing. Choosing what? Choosing to be selfish? Choosing to ignore everything I've sacrificed to get you to this point? Her voice was rising, and I could see 24 years of suppressed fear and frustration bubbling to the surface. Do you think I enjoyed working double shifts at the hospital? Do you think I liked coming home so tired I could barely stand, just so you could have textbooks and lab fees and all the other things that fancy education required? I never asked you to. Of course you didn't ask. Children don't ask for sacrifice. They just assume it's their right. You assumed you deserved to pursue your interests while I held everything together. You assumed that your dreams were more important than my exhaustion. And now you want to assume that I'll support you through more years of uncertainty while you chase something that might never amount to anything. The kitchen felt too small to contain this argument, too small to hold the accumulated resentment and love and fear that had been building between us for years. I wanted to explain that this wasn't about selfishness, that the research could help solve problems that affected everyone, that some things were worth pursuing, even if they didn't come with guarantees. But I could see that she was past the point of listening to explanations. I raised you to be better than this. I raised you to understand the difference between fantasy and reality, between what we want and what we can actually afford. Your father was a dreamer too, Sarah. Look how that turned out. There it was again, the comparison I'd been dreading. The suggestion that ambition was just another word for abandonment, that pursuing difficult goals was really just a sophisticated form of running away from responsibility. I'm not running away from anything, I said, though my voice lacked conviction even to my own ears. I'm trying to run towards something that matters. What matters is security. What matters is stability. What matters is not spending the rest of your life wondering where the next paycheck is coming from. She was crying now, though she was trying to hide it, wiping her eyes with the same angry precision she brought to everything else. I can't do it anymore, Sarah. I can't spend the next 10 years worrying about whether you're eating enough, whether you can pay your rent, whether you're going to call me someday and tell me you need money you know I don't have. The conversation was spiraling beyond the point of rational discussion, becoming something more primal and desperate. I could see that we weren't really arguing about career choices anymore. We were arguing about love and obligation and the different ways people tried to protect each other from the world's casual cruelty. What if I said I'd take the Northwestern scholarship? I asked quietly. What if I promised to do the business program, work for one of their companies, build the kind of stable career you want for me? She looked at me with something that might have been relief. Would you really? If that's what it takes to prove that I'm not like him, if that's what it takes to show you that I'm grateful for everything you've done. The words tasted like ashes, but they were what she needed to hear. It's not about gratitude, she said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. It's about making smart choices. It's about not throwing away opportunities that might not come again. I nodded, but even as I did, I felt something essential inside me begin to wither. This was how dreams died, I realized. Not in dramatic moments of defiance or failure, but in quiet conversations where love became indistinguishable from control, where protecting someone meant limiting their possibilities. That evening, I called Dean Morrison and accepted the scholarship. His enthusiasm was palpable, and he assured me that I was making an excellent choice, that this program would open doors I couldn't even imagine yet. After I hung up, I sat in my childhood bedroom and stared at the periodic table poster, trying to remember what it had felt like to believe that understanding the world was the most important thing I could do with my life. But I couldn't quite bring myself to call Dr. Peterson and turn down the MIT opportunity. Not yet. Some stubborn part of me wasn't ready to close that door permanently, even though I knew that leaving it open was just prolonging the inevitable. 2 days later, my mother was humming while she made breakfast, the first time I'd heard her sound genuinely happy in months. She'd already started making plans, calculating how much money I'd be able to save, researching apartments near Northwestern, talking about visiting me in Chicago once I was settled. She'd called Aunt Linda with the news, and I could hear the pride in her voice as she described the scholarship, the guaranteed job placement, the bright future that was finally within reach. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt like I was watching my life happen to someone else, like I was a spectator to my own surrender. On Thursday morning, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer anyway. Is this Sarah Chen? Yes, this is Sarah. This is Dean Harrison from the Office of Academic Affairs at Northwestern. I'm calling regarding the scholarship you accepted on Tuesday. My stomach dropped. Is there a problem? I'm afraid there is. We've discovered an irregularity in the funding for the environmental business program. It appears that the donor who pledged the endowment has withdrawn their commitment. The program is being suspended indefinitely. The room seemed to tilt around me. I don't understand. Dean Morrison said. Dean Morrison was operating under information he believed to be accurate at the time. Unfortunately, these situations sometimes develop very quickly. We sincerely apologize for any inconvenience this may cause. Inconvenience. As if having my future yanked away with less than 24 hours' notice was merely an inconvenience. As if the careful compromise I'd constructed between my mother's needs and my own hadn't just collapsed completely. What about the regular MBA program? My acceptance there? That remains valid, of course, but without the specialized scholarship, you'd be responsible for the full tuition costs. I understand that may change your calculus considerably. Full tuition. The kind of debt that would take decades to pay off. The kind of financial burden that would make my mother's current struggles look manageable by comparison. There was no way I could ask her to support that kind of risk. No way I could justify taking on that kind of debt for a degree I didn't even want. After I hung up, I sat in stunned silence for several minutes trying to process what had just happened. The compromise was gone. The careful middle path between my dreams and my mother's fears had simply evaporated, leaving me with the same impossible choice I'd been avoiding for days. I could hear my mother moving around downstairs, probably still planning our bright, secure future. In a few minutes, I would have to go down and tell her that the scholarship was gone, that we were back where we'd started, that all her hopes and calculations had been built on promises that someone else had been unable to keep. Or I could call Dr. Peterson and accept the MIT position. I could choose the path that led toward uncertainty and possibility, toward the kind of work that made me feel most like myself, toward a future that might not include financial security, but would include the chance to contribute something meaningful to the world's understanding of itself. The choice was clearer now, stripped of the comfortable illusions that had made compromise seem possible. I could choose safety or purpose, my mother's dreams or my own, the daughter she needed me to be, or the scientist I'd always known I was meant to become. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Peterson. Friendly reminder that MIT needs your answer by tomorrow. Whatever you decide, I'm proud of the researcher and person you've become. I stared at the message for a long moment, then looked around my childhood room one more time. The debate trophies caught the afternoon light streaming through the window, and I remembered the girl who had won them, who had stood on stages and argued passionately for positions she believed in, who had never backed down from a fight she thought was worth having. That girl would have known what to do. The question was whether I still had the courage to be her. Downstairs, I could hear my mother starting dinner preparations, the familiar sounds of domesticity and care that had been the soundtrack of my childhood. Soon, I would have to tell her that everything had changed again, that the future we'd planned together had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. But first, I had a phone call to make. I dialed Dr. Peterson's number with trembling fingers, each digit feeling like a small act of rebellion against everything I'd been taught about safety and sensible choices. The phone rang once, twice, and I almost hung up before his familiar voice answered on the third ring. "Sarah, I was hoping you'd call. Please tell me you have good news." The warmth in his voice almost undid me completely. For 4 years, Dr. Peterson had been more than an advisor. He'd been the first adult who'd seen my curiosity as something valuable rather than inconvenient, who'd encouraged me to ask harder questions instead of seeking easier answers. In his lab, I'd discovered not just the mechanics of molecular biology, but the joy of understanding how life worked at its most fundamental level. Dr. Peterson, my voice cut, and I had to take a breath before continuing. "I need to tell you about MIT. My answer." "Of course, take your time." I looked around my childhood bedroom one more time, at the evidence of a girl who'd believed that knowledge could transform everything, and felt something shift inside me, like tectonic plates finding their true alignment.
I want to accept the position. I want to come to MIT and do the research. The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to make me wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake, if I'd misunderstood something fundamental about the opportunity or my own qualifications. Then Dr. Peterson's voice came through, warm with something that sounded like relief. "Sarah, that's wonderful news. I can't tell you how happy I am to hear that. Dr. Martinez is going to be thrilled. She's been hoping you'd say yes ever since she reviewed your thesis work." "There's just one thing," I said quickly, before I could lose my nerve. "My mother. She doesn't understand. She thinks I'm making a mistake, throwing away security for something uncertain. She burned my diploma, Dr. Peterson. She literally burned it because she was so angry about my wanting to pursue graduate school." "Oh, Sarah." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many brilliant students caught between their potential and their family's fears. "That must have been incredibly painful for both of you." I don't know how to make her understand that this isn't about rejecting everything she's done for me. It's about using the foundation she helped me build to do something meaningful. But every time I try to explain it, she just sees selfishness. "Have you told her about the specifics of the research? About what we're actually trying to accomplish?" I realized with a start that I hadn't. Every conversation with my mother had been about abstractions, about dreams versus reality, about security versus uncertainty. I'd never actually explained the science, never tried to help her understand what photosynthetic efficiency research could mean for the world's energy future. "No," I admitted, "I don't think she'd understand the technical aspects." "Sarah, I want you to consider something. Your mother has spent her entire adult life fighting for survival, working jobs she probably didn't love to ensure you had opportunities she never had. She understands sacrifice better than most people. What if the problem isn't that she can't understand what you want to do, but that you haven't shown her how your work connects to the same values that have driven her all these years?"
The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. I'd been so focused on defending my right to choose my own path that I'd never considered whether my mother and I might actually be fighting for the same things, just in different languages. "I should go," I said, though I didn't want to end the conversation. "I need to tell her about MIT and about the scholarship that fell through." "The scholarship fell through?" "Northwestern. The program got canceled. The funding disappeared." I tried to keep my voice steady, though saying it out loud made the precariousness of my situation feel more real. "So it's not even about choosing between security and uncertainty anymore. It's just uncertainty, with different price tags attached." "Sarah, listen to me carefully. What you're choosing to pursue at MIT, it's not just academic exercise. The research we're doing has the potential to change how the world produces energy, to help solve climate change, to create technologies that could lift billions of people out of poverty. That's not uncertainty for its own sake. That's courage in service of something larger than yourself." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering dusk of my childhood room and tried to gather the courage to go downstairs and face my mother. You're right, it doesn't guarantee anything. But Mom, what if it's not about guarantees? What if it's about using the gifts you helped me develop to try to solve problems that actually matter? And what if you spend 10 years trying to save the world and end up with nothing to show for it? What if you wake up at 35 and realize that all your friends have houses and families and retirement accounts while you're still living like a graduate student, still chasing discoveries that might never come? The questions hit their mark because they echoed my own deepest fears. What if I wasn't as talented as Dr. Peterson believed? What if the research led nowhere? What if I was just a mediocre scientist with delusions of grandeur, destined to spend my career writing grant applications and teaching introductory biology to uninterested undergraduates? I don't know, I admitted. I don't know if I'm good enough to make the kind of discoveries that would justify all this uncertainty. But I know that if I don't try, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been possible. My mother was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been in days. Do you remember when you were 8 years old and you found that injured bird in the backyard? I nodded, though I wasn't sure where she was going with this. You spent 3 weeks nursing that bird back to health. You researched what to feed it, how to care for it, made me drive to 3 different pet stores to find the right supplies. And when it was strong enough to fly again, you cried when we released it because you were going to miss taking care of it. I remember. I was so proud of you that day. Not because you'd saved one bird. Birds die all the time. It's part of nature. I was proud because you saw something that needed help and you refused to walk away, even when it was difficult, even when it would have been easier to just let nature take its course. She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen since I was that 8-year-old girl with a cardboard box full of hope. Maybe that's what you're doing now. Maybe you see a world that needs help and you can't walk away. The recognition in her voice caught me off guard, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion. I can't walk away, Mom. I've tried, but I can't. Every time I imagine myself in a corporate job, making good money, but not really contributing anything meaningful, I feel like I'm betraying everything you taught me about the importance of hard work and purpose. Purpose, she repeated the word, as if tasting it for the first time. I always thought purpose was about security, about building a stable life. But maybe purpose is about using your gifts in service of something larger than yourself. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us trying to process this shift in our understanding of each other. The kitchen smelled like home, like all the meals she'd prepared over the years, all the conversations we'd had at this table, all the dreams we'd shared and argued about and sometimes abandoned. If you do this, she said finally, if you go to MIT and pursue this research, what would that look like practically? How would you survive? I realized I'd been so focused on the emotional and intellectual aspects of the decision that I hadn't fully considered the logistics. The research assistantship comes with a stipend. It's not much, but it's enough to live on. I'd have health insurance through the university. And after I finished the PhD, there would be postdoc opportunities, maybe eventually a faculty position somewhere. How long would all of that take? The PhD would be 5 or 6 years, maybe longer if the research takes unexpected directions. Then probably 2 or 3 years of postdoc work before I could compete for permanent positions. 8 or 9 years before you have a real job.
8 or 9 years before I have a traditional job, I corrected. But Mom, the work I'd be doing during those years, it wouldn't be just preparing for a career. It would be contributing to research that could have real impact. She was quiet again, and I could see her trying to reconcile this timeline with everything she'd believed about the importance of financial security. 9 years was a long time to live on graduate student stipends, a long time to defer the conventional markers of adult success. There's something else, she said suddenly, something I never told you about your father. The change of subject caught me off guard. My mother rarely talked about David Chen, and when she did, it was usually in the context of cautionary tales about the dangers of irresponsibility and broken promises. When I met your father, he was in graduate school, chemistry PhD at the University of Chicago. He was brilliant, Sarah, brilliant in the same way you are. He could look at a problem that had stumped other people and see solutions that seemed obvious once he explained them. I stared at her, trying to process this new information. In my memory, my father was a figure of weakness and abandonment, a man who'd chosen his own comfort over his family's well-being. The idea that he'd been a scientist, that he'd possessed the same kind of intellectual curiosity that drove me, was almost too strange to accept. What happened to him, to his research? He got discouraged. The work was harder than he'd expected, the competition was fierce, and there were setbacks. Experiments that didn't work, papers that got rejected, advisors who didn't believe in his ideas. Her voice carried the weight of old sadness, of dreams that had withered under pressure. Instead of pushing through the difficulties, he started looking for easier paths, get-rich-quick schemes, business ventures that promised overnight success. He convinced himself that traditional academic career paths were for people who weren't smart enough to think outside the box. And then he left. And then he left. But not because he was pursuing his dreams, Sarah. He left because he'd given up on them and couldn't stand being reminded of what he'd abandoned. The revelation hung between us, like a bridge I hadn't known existed. For the first time, I understood why my mother's fears about my career choices ran so deep, why she saw graduate school as the beginning of a pattern that had already broken her heart once. "I'm not him," I said quietly. "No, you're not. You have something he never had, the ability to persist through difficulty without losing sight of what matters. You've already proven that by getting through 4 years of undergraduate work while holding down multiple jobs. You've already shown that you can handle setbacks without giving up. But you're still scared." "Of course I'm scared. I'm terrified that you'll spend the best years of your life pursuing something that might not work out, that you'll end up struggling financially while your peers are building stable careers." She reached across the table and took my hand. "But I'm more terrified of the possibility that you'll spend your life regretting the chances you didn't take." The admission was like a gift, unexpected and precious. For the first time in weeks, I felt like my mother and I were on the same side, facing the same fears and uncertainties together, instead of arguing about them from opposite positions. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," I said. "Dr. Peterson explained something to me today about the research. The work we're doing, it's not just about energy. It's about creating technologies that could help people in developing countries. People who don't have access to reliable electricity. People who are stuck in the same kind of poverty we experienced when I was little." "What do you mean?"
I mean that if we succeed in developing efficient artificial photosynthesis systems, we could create decentralized energy production that doesn't require massive infrastructure investments. Villages that have never had electricity could generate their own power. Communities that can't afford fossil fuels could have access to clean energy. It's about using science to address the same kinds of inequalities that shaped our own lives. I watched understanding dawn in my mother's eyes, saw her beginning to connect the work I wanted to do with the values that had driven her own choices for 24 years. The fight for opportunity, for dignity, for the chance to build something better than what you'd inherited. These weren't abstract concepts to someone who'd scrubbed floors and worked double shifts to ensure her daughter had chances she'd never had. "So it's not just about saving the world," she said slowly. "It's about saving people like us. It's about giving people like us more options than just survival," I agreed. We sat together in the kitchen as darkness fell outside, both of us trying to imagine what the future might look like if we were brave enough to choose possibility over security. The pot on the stove had gone cold, dinner forgotten in the weight of this conversation that was reshaping everything we thought we knew about each other's dreams. Finally, my mother stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where she'd raised me, where she'd built a life from the raw materials of determination and sacrifice. "If you do this, if you go to MIT, I want you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll call me every week. Promise me you'll be honest about how you're doing, about whether you're struggling, about whether you need help. And promise me that if it becomes clear that this path isn't working, you'll be brave enough to change course instead of stubborn enough to keep failing." "I promise." She turned back to face me, and I saw something in her expression that I'd been hoping to see for years. Not just resignation or support born of obligation, but genuine pride in the person I was becoming. Your father gave up too easily, but you're going to fight for what matters. I can see it in you. I've always been able to see it. That night, I called Dr. Peterson and confirmed my acceptance of the MIT position. I called the graduate admissions office and completed the enrollment process. I started making lists of what I'd need to pack, what I'd need to research before starting the program, how I'd organize my life around the pursuit of discoveries that might change everything or nothing at all. But most importantly, I finally understood the choice I was making wasn't about rejecting my mother's values. It was about applying them in a way that honored both her sacrifices and my own potential. The girl who'd spent weeks nursing an injured bird back to health had grown into a woman who wanted to heal the planet's energy systems. The daughter of a woman who'd fought poverty and discrimination had chosen to fight the same battles on a different scale, using different weapons, pursuing the same essential goal of creating more opportunities for people who'd been born with fewer advantages. As I fell asleep that night, I thought about the diploma my mother had burned, about the ashes that represented both an ending and a beginning. Tomorrow, I would start the process of becoming the scientist I'd always known I was meant to be. But tonight, I was grateful for the recognition that my mother and I had finally found a way to see the same future, even if we'd taken very different paths to get there.
3 weeks had passed since that transformative conversation in our kitchen, and the house had settled into a new rhythm, one of preparation rather than conflict, of shared purpose rather than opposing dreams. My mother had thrown herself into helping me prepare for MIT with the same focused determination she'd once applied to discouraging the idea, researching everything from Cambridge housing options to the best ways to stretch a graduate student stipend. I was sitting at the kitchen table, laptop open to MIT's graduate student handbook, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and I almost let it go to voicemail. I'd been fielding calls from various university departments all week, sorting out the administrative details of my new life. Sarah Chen speaking. Ms. Chen, this is Dean Richardson from the Office of Development at Northwestern University. I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time. I glanced at my mother, who was washing dishes but clearly listening to every word. No, not at all. How can I help you? Actually, I believe I can help you. I'm calling about a rather extraordinary situation that's developed regarding your scholarship application for our environmental business program. My stomach dropped. I'd been trying not to think about Northwestern, about the scholarship that had briefly seemed like the perfect compromise before disappearing entirely. I thought that program had been suspended. It had been, yes, but something remarkable has happened, and I wanted to speak with you personally before the story becomes public. There was something in Dean Richardson's voice, excitement maybe, or the kind of barely contained energy that comes with delivering unexpected news. Miss Chen, are you familiar with the name Elena Rodriguez? No, I don't think so. Elena Rodriguez is the founder and CEO of Solaritech, one of the largest renewable energy companies in the world. She's also a Northwestern alumna, class of 1987, and one of our most generous benefactors. Yesterday, she called my office with a very specific request. I was scribbling notes on a piece of paper, trying to follow the thread of what Dean Richardson was telling me. My mother had abandoned all pretense of washing dishes and was standing behind my chair, close enough to hear both sides of the conversation. I could feel her tension radiating like heat. Ms. Rodriguez had heard through various channels about the suspension of our environmental business program. Apparently, news travels quickly in the renewable energy sector. More importantly, she'd heard about your specific case. My case? Yes. It seems that Dean Morrison had been quite enthusiastic about your application, even after the program was canceled. He'd mentioned you to several colleagues, including some in the private sector, as an example of the kind of student the program had been designed to attract. I was having trouble processing this information. The idea that my name had been circulating in conversations I knew nothing about,
that strangers had been discussing my academic career and future prospects was both thrilling and terrifying. Ms. Rodriguez asked Dean Morrison to send your complete file, including your undergraduate thesis. She read my thesis? She did. And Ms. Chen, I have to tell you that in 25 years of working in university development, I've never seen anything quite like what happened next. My mother had given up all pretense of kitchen work and had moved to stand behind my chair, close enough to hear both sides of the conversation. I could feel her tension radiating like heat. Elena Rodriguez didn't just read your thesis. She shared it with her research and development team at Solaritech. Your work on chloroplast optimization caught their attention immediately. Apparently, it addresses some of the same challenges they've been wrestling with in their artificial photosynthesis research.
The words hung in the air like smoke, and I felt something shift in my understanding of what was possible. My undergraduate research, work I'd done in between shifts at the campus coffee shop, experiments I'd conducted on borrowed equipment, a project I'd assumed would be read by maybe 3 professors and then filed away forever, had somehow found its way to people who were trying to solve the same problems on an industrial scale. Ms. Rodriguez called me yesterday with a proposal that I can honestly say is unprecedented in my experience. She wants to establish a new scholarship program, not just for the environmental business program, which she's agreed to fund for the next 10 years, but specifically for students who combine scientific training with business education. I don't understand. She wants to create what she's calling the Rodriguez Innovation Fellowship. It would provide full tuition, living expenses, and research opportunities for 5 students per year who have the kind of interdisciplinary background you represent. Scientists who understand business applications or business students with serious scientific training. My hand was shaking as I wrote this down, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. That's incredible. But I don't see how this affects me. I've already committed to MIT, and the fellowship wouldn't be available until next year at the earliest. That's where the story becomes truly extraordinary, Ms. Chen. Elena Rodriguez doesn't want to wait until next year. She wants to launch the program immediately, and she wants you to be the inaugural fellow. The kitchen seemed to spin around me. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Ms. Rodriguez is prepared to offer you a full fellowship to Northwestern's environmental business program with several additional components that I think will interest you greatly. First, instead of the standard 2-year MBA program, you'd be enrolled in a customized 3-year program that would include advanced coursework in both business and environmental science. I was scribbling frantically, trying to capture every detail. What kind of environmental science coursework? That's the remarkable part. She's arranged for you to spend 1 day per week at Argonne National Laboratory working directly with their renewable energy research team. You'd essentially be pursuing an MBA with a significant research component, keeping your scientific training active while developing business expertise. And second, the fellowship includes guaranteed summer internships at Solaritech, working directly with their R&D division. Ms. Rodriguez wants to see how business-trained scientists approach problems differently than traditional researchers. Third, and I think this is what makes the offer truly unprecedented, she's committed to funding a research project of your choice during your final year of the program, up to $2 million in research funding to pursue whatever direction your work takes you. $2 million. I wrote the number down and stared at it, trying to comprehend what it meant. $2 million to pursue research that could bridge the gap between scientific discovery and practical application, between the laboratory and the marketplace. Ms. Chen, are you still there? Yes, I'm here. I'm trying to process this. I understand. It's a lot to take in, but there's one more thing I need to tell you, and this is perhaps the most important part of the entire offer. What's that? Elena Rodriguez wants to meet with you personally. She'll be in Chicago tomorrow for a board meeting, and she's asked that you'd be willing to have lunch with her. She wants to discuss not just the fellowship, but her vision for how business education can accelerate environmental solutions. I looked up at my mother, who was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, part shock, part pride, part something that might have been vindication.
This was beyond anything either of us had imagined possible, beyond the careful compromises we'd been constructing between dreams and reality. Dean Richardson, I have to ask, why me? There must be hundreds of students with similar backgrounds, students who haven't already committed to other programs. Miss Rodriguez was very specific about that. She said that anyone can write a good thesis, but your work showed something more than technical competence. It showed the ability to see connections that other people miss, to ask questions that advance the field in unexpected directions. She said it reminded her of her own graduate work 30 years ago. After I hung up, my mother and I sat in silence for several minutes, both of us trying to absorb what had just happened. The fellowship offer was so far beyond anything we'd considered possible that it felt almost unreal, like good news that was too good to trust. $2 million, my mother said finally. $2 million, I repeated. For research? For research that could bridge business and science, that could take laboratory discoveries and turn them into technologies that actually help people. She was quiet for another moment, and I could see her mind working through the implications. This wasn't just an academic opportunity, it was a chance to combine scientific research with business training, to develop the skills that could help me translate discoveries into real-world applications. It was, in many ways, exactly what she'd been hoping for when she'd pushed me toward business school. Except it came with the research component that made my heart race with possibility. "What about MIT?" she asked. It was the question I'd been dreading since Dean Richardson had started describing the fellowship. MIT represented the pure pursuit of scientific knowledge, the chance to work with some of the best researchers in the world, the opportunity to contribute to fundamental understanding of biological processes. The Northwestern Fellowship offered something different, a chance to bridge the gap between discovery and application, between the laboratory and the marketplace. I don't know, I admitted. A week ago, the choice seemed clear. MIT was what I wanted. Northwestern was what you wanted. But this changes everything. How so? Because it's not about choosing between science and business anymore. It's about choosing different ways of doing science. Pure research versus applied research. Laboratory discoveries versus commercial applications. I stared at the notes I'd scribbled during the phone call, trying to organize my thoughts. Elena Rodriguez is offering me the chance to keep one foot in both worlds. And which world feels right to you? It was a good question. Maybe the most important question. I thought about my time in Dr. Peterson's lab, about the joy I'd felt when experiments worked, when data revealed patterns that no one had seen before. I thought about the satisfaction of understanding something fundamental about how life operated at the cellular level. But I also thought about the injured bird I'd nursed back to health when I was 8, about the practical application of knowledge to solve real problems. I thought about my mother's struggles, about communities around the world that lacked access to reliable energy, about the difference between knowing how photosynthesis worked and using that knowledge to create technologies that actually help people. I think, I said slowly, that I've been thinking about this wrong. I've been treating pure research and applied research like they're opposites, like I have to choose between understanding the world and changing it. But maybe the best science happens when you're trying to do both. My mother nodded thoughtfully. And this fellowship would let you do both? It would let me try. I'd still be doing research, but research that's explicitly connected to practical applications. I'd still be learning about renewable energy and environmental solutions, but from a perspective that includes business strategy and market considerations. And the $2 million?
This could be it, my mother said, her voice bright with possibility. This could be the answer we've been looking for. I nodded and smiled, But inside, I felt the familiar weight of expectations settling over me once again. Tomorrow, I would put on my interview suit and convince a dean that I belonged in his program. I would be articulate and impressive and grateful for this unexpected opportunity. And then, I would have to decide whether getting what everyone else wanted for me was worth giving up what I wanted for myself. The coffee had gone cold in my cup, but I drank it anyway, tasting the bitter grounds that had settled at the bottom. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up to another ordinary day, but inside our kitchen, the future hung suspended between what was practical and what was possible, waiting for me to finally choose which version of myself I was brave enough to become. The Northwestern campus gleamed in the morning sunlight like a promise of everything my mother had ever wanted for me. Limestone buildings rose from manicured lawns with the confidence of an institution that had been shaping leaders for over a century. And as I walked toward the business school, I felt the weight of expectation pressing down on my shoulders like a perfectly tailored blazer that didn't quite fit. I had chosen my outfit carefully, the same navy suit I'd worn to job fairs, paired with the pearl earrings my mother had given me for graduation. The earrings had belonged to her mother, one of the few things that had survived the journey from Taiwan to America, and wearing them felt like carrying forward a legacy of sacrifice and pragmatism that stretched back through generations of women who had chosen security over dreams, because dreams were luxuries they couldn't afford. Dean Morrison's office overlooked the courtyard where future MBA students would network and strategize and learn to speak the language of profit margins and market penetration. The dean himself was exactly what I had expected, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that came from decades of making decisions that mattered. He greeted me with a firm handshake and the sort of smile that suggested he was already mentally writing my acceptance letter. "Sarah, thank you for coming in on such short notice. Please, have a seat." He gestured to a leather chair positioned across from his mahogany desk, which was decorated with the usual academic accessories: books on leadership theory, a crystal paperweight, photographs of him with various dignitaries and business leaders. "I have to say, your academic record is truly impressive. Summa cum laude in molecular biology, research experience, excellent GRE scores. You're exactly the kind of candidate we're looking for."
So you decided to bridge that gap yourself? I decided to try. Solara Tech has been successful because we've always hired people who can think across disciplines, who understand both the science and the business applications. But there aren't enough of those people, and the traditional educational system doesn't really train them. She leaned forward, and I could see the passion that had driven her to build a multi-billion-dollar company from scratch. "Sarah, what I'm offering you isn't just a scholarship. It's a chance to become part of the next generation of leaders who can translate scientific discoveries into technologies that actually change people's lives." "And you think I have that potential?" "I think you have something more valuable than potential. I think you have perspective. Your thesis wasn't just technically accomplished. It showed that you understand how scientific research connects to real-world applications. You asked questions that were both scientifically rigorous and practically relevant." "But I don't have any business experience." "Neither did I when I started, but you have something more important. You have the ability to see problems from multiple angles, to understand both the scientific challenges and the human needs that drive innovation." She paused, studying my face. "Sarah, can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "What drives you? What gets you excited about the work you want to do?" I thought about my mother's struggles, about the communities around the world that lacked access to reliable energy, about the possibility of using scientific knowledge to solve problems that affected millions of people. Elena Rodriguez smiled, and I saw recognition in her eyes. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. Sarah, the fellowship I'm offering isn't just about combining business education with scientific training. It's about developing leaders who understand that the purpose of innovation is to improve human welfare, that the best technologies are the ones that help people who need help the most. When I drove home that afternoon, I felt like I was carrying the future in my passenger seat. Elena Rodriguez hadn't just offered me a fellowship, she'd offered me a vision of how to spend my career, a way to honor both my scientific training and my desire to solve real-world problems. My mother was waiting in the kitchen when I got home, and I could see the question in her eyes before I'd even taken off my coat. How did it go? Mom, I said, sitting down across from her at the table where we'd had so many important conversations, I think I know what I want to do with my life. I told her about my conversation with Elena Rodriguez, about the vision of science and business working together to solve problems that mattered, about the opportunity to develop technologies that could help people who'd faced the same kinds of challenges we'd faced. My mother listened with the same focused attention she'd given to my explanations of molecular biology, and I could see her beginning to understand how this fellowship represented not just a career opportunity, but a chance to use everything I'd learned in service of values we both shared. So, you're going to accept the fellowship? I'm going to accept the fellowship. And MIT? I called Dr. Peterson this afternoon. He said that research will always be there, that the questions I want to explore don't disappear just because I approach them from a different angle. He said that maybe the world needs scientists who understand business as much as it needs business people who understand science.
That evening, I called Dean Richardson and formally accepted the Rodriguez Innovation Fellowship. I called Dr. Peterson and thanked him for 4 years of mentorship that had prepared me for opportunities I couldn't have imagined. I called Elena Rodriguez and told her that I was honored to be the inaugural fellow, that I was excited to explore how business education could accelerate environmental solutions. But most importantly, I sat with my mother in our kitchen and realized that we'd found something we'd been searching for without knowing it. A way for me to honor her sacrifices while pursuing my dreams, a path that combined the security she wanted for me with the purpose I needed for myself. The girl who'd nursed an injured bird back to health had grown into a woman who wanted to heal the planet's energy systems. The daughter of a woman who'd fought poverty and discrimination had chosen to fight the same battles on a different scale. And for the first time since I'd graduated from college, my mother and I could see the same future, one where science and business worked together to create opportunities for people who needed them most. As I fell asleep that night, I thought about the diploma my mother had burned, about the ashes that had represented both an ending and a beginning. Tomorrow, I would start the process of becoming not just the scientist I'd always known I was meant to be, but the kind of leader who could bridge worlds, who could translate discoveries into solutions, who could use knowledge in service of hope. The $2 million in research funding felt like a promise, not just of what I might discover, but of what might become possible when young people were given the resources to pursue their biggest questions. And in that promise, I could finally see the legacy my mother and I were building together. A future where dreams and reality weren't opposites, but partners in the work of making the world better than we'd found it.
Elena herself sat at the head of the table, and when our eyes met, I saw the same focused energy that had impressed me during our first lunch meeting years ago. She'd taken a considerable risk in funding my research, and I knew that today's presentation would determine whether that risk had been justified. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, thank you for joining us today. What I'm about to show you represents a potential solution to one of the most pressing challenges of our time: how to produce clean, renewable energy at a scale that can actually replace fossil fuels. I clicked to the first slide, which showed a simple diagram of natural photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide into chemical energy. It was the same process I'd studied as an undergraduate, the same elegant biological machinery that had inspired my senior thesis, and ultimately led me to this moment. We've recreated how plants turn sunlight into fuel artificially. I could see the investors following along, some of them making notes, others leaning forward, with the kind of attention that suggested they understood the implications of what I was describing. Clean fuel production from sunlight and water. It was the holy grail of renewable energy research, the technology that could finally make fossil fuels obsolete. Traditional artificial photosynthesis systems have been limited by low efficiency rates, typically around 5 to 7% conversion of solar energy to chemical fuel. These rates are too low for commercial viability, which is why artificial photosynthesis has remained primarily an academic curiosity rather than a practical energy solution. I clicked to the next slide, which showed the prototype system we'd developed, an array of synthetic catalysts and light-absorbing materials that looked nothing like the elegant green leaves that had inspired it, but performed the same essential function. Our breakthrough came from applying principles of molecular biology to material science. Instead of trying to recreate photosynthesis exactly as it occurs in nature, we focused on optimizing each step of the process independently, then integrating those optimizations into a coherent system. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, covering the technical details of our catalyst design, the engineering challenges we'd overcome, the scalability projections that suggested this technology could be manufactured at industrial scale. But the moment that mattered most came when we moved to the demonstration room, where our prototype system was quietly converting sunlight and water into hydrogen fuel at an efficiency rate that would have seemed impossible just 5 years ago. 23% efficiency, I announced as the data appeared on the monitor, sustained over continuous operation for the past 6 months with no degradation in performance. The silence that followed lasted just long enough for me to wonder if I had somehow miscommunicated the significance of what we'd achieved. Then Elena Rodriguez started clapping, and the sound rippled through the room as the investors began to understand that they were witnessing something that could change everything. "Dr. Chen," said Dr. Williams, a representative from the Department of Energy, "what would it take to scale this technology to utility-level production?" "We've modeled that extensively," I replied, pulling up the projections Marcus and I had spent months preparing. "With proper funding, we could have demonstration plants operational within 2 years, commercial deployment within 5. The capital cost would be comparable to current solar installations, but the advantage is energy storage. Instead of producing electricity that has to be used immediately or stored in batteries, we're producing hydrogen fuel that can be stored indefinitely and used on demand." And the market applications? Global. Decentralized energy production for communities that lack reliable grid access. Industrial fuel production for applications that require high energy density. Transportation fuel for vehicles that need longer range than battery electric systems can provide. I looked around the room at faces that were beginning to show the kind of excitement that comes with recognizing a genuine breakthrough. This technology doesn't just provide clean energy, it provides energy independence.
After the investors left, promising follow-up meetings and due diligence processes that could lead to the kind of funding that would transform our prototype into a commercial reality, I found myself alone in the laboratory with Elena Rodriguez. She stood at the window overlooking the city, and I could see in her posture the satisfaction of someone whose long-term vision was finally coming to fruition. "5 years ago," she said without turning around, "you were a young woman trying to figure out how to balance your mother's expectations with your own dreams. Today, you're the lead researcher on technology that could change how the world produces energy. How does that feel?" "Surreal," I admitted. "When I was an undergraduate, I used to fantasize about making discoveries that mattered, about contributing something meaningful to human knowledge. But I never imagined it would happen this quickly, or that it would grow out of the research I was already doing." "That's the thing about breakthrough discoveries," Elena said, finally turning to face me. "They rarely come from completely new directions. They come from asking slightly different questions about problems people have been working on for years." "Is that what you did with Solara Tech?" "In a way, I didn't invent solar energy technology. That had been around for decades when I started the company. But I asked different questions about how to make it more efficient, more affordable, more accessible to communities that needed it most.
She smiled, and I saw in her expression the same pride I'd seen in my mother's face when I'd first described the fellowship opportunity. The difference is that you're asking those questions with both scientific rigor and business insight. That combination is what makes breakthrough discoveries into breakthrough technologies. We talked for another hour about the next steps for the research, about the partnerships that would be necessary to scale the technology, about the potential impact on global energy markets. But eventually, the conversation turned to more personal topics. "How's your mother?" Elena asked. "She's good, really good, actually. She retired from the hospital last year, finally, and she's been taking art classes at the community college. Painting, can you believe it? She says she spent so many years focused on survival that she forgot about beauty. And how does she feel about your work now?" I thought about the conversation I'd had with my mother just last week when I'd called to tell her about the investor presentation. She'd listened to my description of the technology with the same focused attention she'd once given me my explanations of why business school was the practical choice. But now her questions were different, not about financial security or career stability, but about which communities would benefit first from the technology, about whether it could help people in situations like the ones we'd faced when I was growing up. She understands now that some choices aren't really about choosing between security and dreams. They're about finding ways to pursue dreams that create security, not just for yourself, but for other people too. That's wisdom that comes from experience, both yours and hers. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the path that had led me to this moment. From a girl burning with curiosity about how life worked at the molecular level, to a woman developing technologies that could help solve humanity's energy challenges. The route had been anything but straight, filled with moments of doubt and conflict, with choices that seemed impossible until they became inevitable.
My apartment was in a renovated warehouse in Chicago's River North neighborhood, close enough to Solaritech that I could walk to work on nice days, modern enough to feel like the kind of place a successful researcher might live, but not so expensive that it felt like a betrayal of the values I'd grown up with. The walls were decorated with photographs from my research travels, a solar installation in rural Kenya where our preliminary technology was being tested, a wind farm in Denmark where I'd presented our findings at an international conference, a group photo from the Argonne National Laboratory team that had taught me how to think like both a scientist and an engineer. But the photograph that meant the most sat on my desk, a picture of my mother and me at my MBA graduation ceremony, both of us crying happy tears as I received the Rodriguez Innovation Fellowship Award. In the background, barely visible, was Elena Rodriguez, watching with the satisfaction of someone whose investment in a young person's potential had paid dividends beyond anything she'd originally imagined. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Saw the news about your presentation on the Solaritech website. So proud of you. Call me when you have time. I want to hear everything." I smiled and made a mental note to call her after dinner. These days, our conversations were less about the practical implications of my career choices and more about the work itself, about which applications excited me most, about the technical challenges that kept me up at night, about the possibility that the research we were doing could help create the kind of world where fewer young people would have to choose between pursuing their dreams and ensuring their survival. Later that evening, as I prepared for bed, I opened my laptop and pulled up the draft of a paper I'd been working on, a review article about the intersection of molecular biology and renewable energy technology that I'd been invited to write for Nature Energy. The introduction began with a quote from my undergraduate thesis advisor, Dr. Peterson, who'd retired the previous year but still sent encouraging emails whenever my research made the news. "The most meaningful scientific discoveries," he'd written, "arise not from answering questions we already know how to ask, but from developing the courage to ask questions we don't yet know how to answer." As I read those words, I thought about the girl who'd sat in her childhood bedroom 5 years ago, torn between the security her mother wanted for her and the curiosity that drove her toward uncertainty. That girl had been asking the wrong question, not whether to choose security or dreams, but how to pursue dreams in ways that created security for herself and others. The research I was doing now, artificial photosynthesis systems that could provide clean energy to communities around the world, represented the answer to that reframed question. It was science in service of human welfare, discovery in pursuit of practical solutions, curiosity channeled toward problems that mattered beyond the laboratory. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed my mother's number, and I answered with the warmth that had replaced the tension in our conversations over the past few years. "Mom, I was just thinking about calling you. I couldn't wait. I read the article about your presentation today on the Solaritech website. Sarah, I have to tell you something." "What's that?" "I've been thinking about what you said 5 years ago, about how your research could help people like us, people who've struggled with poverty and limited opportunities. Today, reading about this technology you've developed, I finally understand what you meant." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you're not just a scientist anymore. You're not even just a businesswoman. You're someone who's using everything you've learned to solve problems that actually matter to real people. You're creating opportunities for communities that have never had reliable access to energy, just like we never had reliable access to financial security when you were growing up." I felt my throat tighten with emotion. For so many years, I'd struggled to help my mother understand that pursuing scientific research wasn't about rejecting the values she'd taught me, but about applying them in a different context. Hearing her make that connection herself, in her own words, felt like a validation I hadn't even known I was seeking.
"The girl who nursed that injured bird back to health," she continued, "she's grown up to nurse the planet back to health. And Sarah, I couldn't be more proud of who you've become." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and thought about legacy. Not just the scientific discoveries that might carry my name, but the values that had shaped how I approached the work. The sense of responsibility to use knowledge in service of hope that my mother had instilled in me through her own example of sacrifice and determination. Tomorrow, I would return to the laboratory and continue the work of turning breakthrough discoveries into practical technologies. I would meet with engineers and business people and government officials, all of whom were working in different ways toward the same goal of creating a more sustainable energy future. I would write grants and review papers and mentor the next generation of researchers who were asking questions at the intersection of science and social impact. But tonight, I was simply grateful for the path that had led me here, for the mother who had fought for my opportunities even when she didn't understand them, for mentors like Dr. Peterson and Elena Rodriguez who had seen potential in a curious girl and helped her transform that curiosity into something that could benefit the world. The artificial photosynthesis prototype in our laboratory would continue running through the night, quietly converting sunlight and water into clean fuel, proving that some dreams were worth pursuing not because they were easy, but because they were necessary. And in that steady, silent work of transformation, I could see the future my mother and I had been building together all along. A world where young people didn't have to choose between security and purpose, where scientific discovery and social responsibility were partners rather than competitors, where the pursuit of knowledge was always guided by the question of how that knowledge could help people build better lives. The girl who had once hidden in her room to avoid disappointing her mother had grown into a woman who was helping to power the world. And in that transformation, I finally understood that the greatest discoveries weren't just about understanding how things worked, but about using that understanding to make things work better for everyone. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear about choosing purpose over convention. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories. As I fell asleep that night, I thought about the diploma my mother had burned 5 years ago, about the ashes that had represented both an ending and a beginning. That piece of paper had documented what I'd learned, but it couldn't contain what I'd become. A scientist, an entrepreneur, a bridge between worlds, a woman who had found a way to honor both her mother's sacrifices and her own potential. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities to transform discovery into hope. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, at the intersection of curiosity and compassion, using everything I'd learned in service of everything I believed, proving that some dreams were worth pursuing not just because they belonged to us, but because they could belong to everyone.